you all know Ellen. I was going to show you pictures of when you first met her, which of course was at Oka, on the television, on the radio, the newspapers, and as she had been chosen and was the spokesperson at the occupation to prevent the, although it was an attack on my culture, to prevent the building of yet another golf course. And of course the disinterment of the traditional burial place for people in that community. I remember that I was left alone that summer in the Native Studies Department, as I believe it then was. I think everyone had fled for summer, this, that, and the other thing. Even my colleague, I think, David Newhouse, was gone, which meant that the switchboard of the university sent all the calls to me because they were phoning up saying, what the hell's going on? So I did take a call, and it was, I picked the phone up and I heard this woman yelling at me, what the hell is going on? She was very upset and very excited. She turned out it was a journalist from Buffalo, and she said to me, I can sit in my office and look across the border and see Canada. She said, it's always been a place of sanity, security, warmth, calm. What the F is going on up there? And of course she was talking about Oka and talking about the coverage and the excitement that had generated. That of course was not even the beginning of Ellen's activist career, and certainly hasn't been the end of her activist career. And she is now nationally and international figure of resistance on many fronts, having to do with the history, culture, language, and identity of Aboriginal people, the sacredness of their land, and the need to protect that land from unrestrained development. She comes to that work as a traditional person, but also having done a fine arts degree at Concordia University, which is, as we all know, there's one or two students who went to Concordia, is most well known for people who teach in the communications program there. And she was, until what, 2010, president of the Quebec Native Women's Association. She's been heavily involved in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as was Jennifer and Paul, who came here last week. So her paper will weave that, as the title shows you, into discussions of assaults on native rights by pipeline development and resource development. So I'm thrilled to be able to bring Ellen Gabriel here this evening and to let her have the floor for as long as she wants. A couple of hours probably. She told me that when Mohawks get started, you know the rest of the sentence, so set your clocks, right? Ellen, thank you.
Sego, kutsagos na Trent na ganyato. Kanya kahagagyan to te kanagana sa tawag na kanagara. Tinurados na nagwatsong ang ka wahotsa. Awanti kot kanisa ar. You know, my Mohawk name is Katsagos. I am Turtle Clan from the community of Kanisadage. You know it as Oka. It's not near Oka or by Oka. Oka is Kanisadage. I'm going to try and take you through a 25-year journey that I've had as an activist since that time. And as John says, you know, Mohawks, once we get started, or I think any Iroquois people, once you get started, it's kind of hard to stop us. So you'll just have to say, come on now, we're sleeping, it's time to go home. So I'm going to try and talk a bit about development, the continued development on Indigenous peoples' lands, the theft of our lands and resources by Canada, by colonial states. And Canada's sovereignty is based on three legal fictions, as are many of states within the Americas. And so we have the doctrine of discovery, papal bulls and terra nullius, and these are all what Canada still bases its sovereignty on, in spite of the kinds of accomplishments and in spite of, I think, even the Constitution Act of 1982 relies on the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, because whenever Canada wants to do something, and when they talk about honor of the Crown and accommodating us, it must not violate Canada's assumed sovereignty over our lands. So Canada has a long way to go as a country in being honest about its origins, in being honest about the genocide that it and its motherland in England, and yes, I will say even in France and other countries, have committed against Indigenous peoples. In 1995, our community published a book, our history book of Kanesatake, and I'm going to take you a little bit through what Kanesatake is, because Indian Affairs still thinks that we come from the Mohawk Valley, and we did not. At least the people from Kanesatake and Tiohtià:ke, which is Montreal, did. There were people in the Mohawk Valley for sure. But one of the things that our elders taught us during this time of research is about peace, and that's what Kainarakoa is supposed to be about. And Kainarakoa is the big law, the great law of peace. And so the foundations of that peace are respect, peace, love, and strength. So we need all of those things to become a healthy nation. And as we know, the genocide, Indian residential schools, and everything about colonialism tried to take that away and tried to destroy that from us. So lasting peace cannot be achieved only through military or political means, but through a higher level of consciousness and understanding. There can be no lasting peace while fear or anger exists between people. And I'm sure Buddha and Jesus Christ and Allah and all the religions of the world, they would agree with the Iroquois philosophy on what is peace and how to achieve that peace. There was no philosopher that wrote it in a book. It was something that our people lived, and I say was. And so in Kanesatake we had Sulpician priests, and Sulpician priests were blue bloods from France. They were not like the Jesuits who took an oath to poverty. They were actually rich blue bloods from France. And the second they arrived in the dead of winter around this time of year, and you can see, like is it Lake Bryce, you called it? Where you see the wind they're walking through the dead of winter in something like that. And only crazy people would do that. And they weren't crazy. These were businessmen who were disguised as priests. And they came to a village they knew existed, and they knew they would be greeted, they knew they would be fed, and they knew they would be kept warm, and in Kanesatake. And the image, the Keystone Pipeline one is one I borrowed off the internet, and the other one is something I just did because of the pipelines and the prophecy of the two-headed snake. And it's a wonderfully written book. It's on our Cultural Center's website. And it talks about, it's a mountain that's really the narrator of our story in Kanesatake, because we have something that we call Goa, and sometimes we call it Blue Mountain. And people from BC, when they come and see our mountain, they go, "What? That's a mountain?" So you have to put it into context of where you are. But one of the quotes, which I really love, is, "The people are emerging from their silence to protest. In great chunks, the land has been eaten up as if by a greedy serpent who leaves behind its children to spread misery and want amongst the people." And this is a quote that comes from the early years, in the early 1700s, around 1716, where this is where we're looking at right now is part of what you call Oka Park. And I saw this wonderful picture, which I know the chief is from Kanesatake, and he was one of the chiefs, and I've been trying to find his name, maybe someone here knows his name. But Kanesatake is the oldest community of the existing, the present communities, the Mohawk communities. We're the oldest community because we are mentioned in the roll call of the chiefs. We were the first community to accept Kainarakoa. And the pottery shards found in Oka Park date at least 3000 BC. And so what you see is what we call the seigneury, and the sense of the Sulpicians, which Louis XIV, the Sun King, gave when he was a teenager to the Sulpician priests. It includes the Montagne, Gros-Blainville, and all those other areas. What Indian Affairs, and which is to the advantage of Enbridge and Trans-Canada and other peoples who are developing, this tiny little piece is what they consider Ganasabage. And during the 1990 crisis or occupation, the government bought our cemetery from the municipality of Oka. They wanted to remove all our ancestors to extend their parking lot for the golf course. But they bought the cemetery for $1, which was a real insult, and we were informed of that during negotiations. But the other thing is that there was slated to be development here of condos. Well, we stopped that as well. The pines are still there, so that's one successful thing that we did that came out of it. But what happened is now there's condominiums all over here. And there's a bill called Bill S-24, which is the Ganasabage Land Management Act, which gives the municipality of Oka, carte blanche to do what it likes, and we have to always accept. We have to accept what the government gives us. And so this is the two-dog wampum. And I heard some people try and explain what this is, and I wish I had a pointer, but maybe I can do it with this. So traditionally, in order to demarcate the end of a village, there was a stick, which you see here. Now the Sulpicians and others believe that this means that the Mohawks' oath to Christianity, but it doesn't. These are the two figures holding the wampum belt here. And you can't really see it in the picture, but there is a slight line in there. And, some people will say, well, that's not true, but I was taught that the white line, which I think is what they're holding here, is a belt of an agreement, because it was with the Sulpicians. This is the land. This is supposed to represent the land, and these are the people. And the two dogs are at the end of each village, and so if there's any harm coming to the people or to the village, the dogs will bark, or the wolves will bark. It kind of depends on your interpretation. But it was not an oath to the Sulpicians. It was not an oath to Christianity. The Ganasabage people always maintained that we never surrendered our land, and it always has been, and it always will be our land. But the Sulpician priests always, like they say, that the white man speaks with forked tongue, no offense to anybody here, but that old cliche was very true when it came to the Sulpician priests, because the Sulpicians would say, okay, we're going to ask your permission if we're going to cut some wood. And this is something that the Mohawk, the Ganakahaga people in Ganasadaga wanted very dearly, because we cultivated the land. We were just waiting for flowers to grow around us and vines to grow around us. The land was cultivated, there was berries, and there was all kinds of things. So we were very careful, our ancestors were very careful in which trees were cut. Well, the Sulpicians turned it around and they said, well, the Mohawks are cutting trees over there. You go arrest them, because this is a violation of the treaty that we signed with them. And so from that time on, we've never had any peace since the Sulpicians, and they brought with them Christian Mohawks, Christian Algonquins and Nipissings. And there's a big debate right now about Ganasadaga and Tiohtià:ke and Montreal about whose land it is, and I can't go into it right now because we could be here all night. One of my heroes, when I was a little girl, there wasn't very many people on the screen other than Tonto, who was exactly from Six Nations. There wasn't very many people that I saw on the big screen that represented people that I knew. And so Chief Dan George became a hero of mine. And later, when I realized how great a leader he was, I started searching some of his speeches. And there's a speech in 1967 that he wrote for Canada, when Canada turned 100 years old. And if you want to Google it, you can. And it's a wonderful speech, but I think it's very relevant today as it was the day he gave it. And this is not part of the speech, it's another one. But we have discarded our broken arrows and our empty quivers, for we know what served us in the past can never serve us again. It is only with tongue and speech that I can fight my people's war. And if you look at how history has represented Indigenous people, you don't think of us as peaceful, right? Your history doesn't teach you that we are peaceful people. We're not going out bombing anybody. We barricade a road, we block a road. You know, when history, even in the U.S., you talk about the American Indian movement, the fights in Wounded Knee. Now we're talking about Oka, Ganasivage, Ipperwash, Gustafson Lake. Those are all images that your children and your grandchildren and probably you have been taught, that we are violent people. But the violence has always originated from your government side, your authority side. And we have always been villainized, just like Bill C-51 will villainize once again, in another way, in a more deeper and more profound way, in a way that will cause us to not have the freedom and dignity and reconciliation and retribution that we have been seeking for generations. And I don't know if any of you in your studies read Kim Anderson. Do people here know Kim Anderson? Kim Anderson's a good friend of mine, and she wrote a book, Life Stages and Native Women. Is anybody familiar with this book? It's a wonderful book, and she's a great storyteller. Excuse me. And one of the things that colonization took away from Indigenous peoples is the importance and the nurturing role that Indigenous women played, not just in the continuation of the languages and the culture, but in governance. She wrote, "If one were to judge by the currently male-dominated arenas of Métis and First Nations politics, it might be easy to assume that governance was typically men's business. The history shared by participants about their grandmother's authorities demonstrates, however, that this was not necessarily the case. Men may have had specified roles that were more visible in terms of politics and governance, but this does not negate the vital role that women, and particularly older women, held in leading and managing their communities." And in today's society, you reach a certain age, you're no longer beautiful, you're no longer relevant if you're a woman. But if you're a man, hey, you know, like you can go to your 80, 90 years old, people will respect your ideas, your thoughts, your leadership, and they won't tell you to step down. I've been told by some people who do not like my politics that you've been there long enough. You know, it's time for you to stand aside. Well, I can't, in good consciousness, unless people don't want to hear me anymore, say that I have to stop what I'm doing, because the fight is far from being over. And the issue of the land is an issue for women. In Iroquois culture, we have clan system. In Mohawks, we have turtle bears and wolves. And if you didn't have a clan, you could be adopted. You could go and ask a clan mother. If you could sit and be with that clan and learn for at least a year all the ceremonies and start learning the language. And it was up to the women to accept you. And today it's like, hey, I have a great grandmother or grandfather who was Cree or Mohawk, so I want my status card because I want everything free. And that's a lie. Everything is not free. It used to be that way, that if people wanted to join us, that they had to learn those languages. And we need to decolonize that way of how we welcome people back into the communities. Health, security, peace, love, and strength, these are parts of having a good mind. And colonization has taken that away. When we saw that the leaders of Idle-No-More were four or five women, I think people were really, really surprised and pleased. And I think it got the old boys network shaking in their boots, because women are re-emerging once again. And it comes in cycles, you know. It's not just because of Idle No More. There are people who have never been idle. And there are women who have never been idle and never given up their place as part of their right to govern in their communities. And if language, passing on the language, and in many communities it is, but if language was solely a men's responsibility, I'm sure indigenous languages would be funded. In Canada, you pay X amount of $1 million for French and English, and you pay people to learn French. You pay people to learn English. But for our languages, which link us to how our ancestors thought, and link us to how our relationship is with the natural environment, for those languages, it's like, yeah, put it on a website and let people hear how it sounds, and that'll be good enough. Learn how to play bingo, and that's good enough. You would not stand for it if that was happening to English. You would not stand for that if that was happening to French. But yet it's okay that this happens to indigenous languages, because we are conquered people, according to the propaganda of the Canadian government. We are wards of the state. The relationship that we have with Canada is a trustee relationship, right? It's not supposed to be adversarial. You're supposed to tell us how to fit in, like the white paper policy wanted us, how we can be like other Canadians, how we can be less offensive to that which is the Canadian identity. And if there's anybody in this room that really knows what the Canadian identity is, please let me know, because I've yet to figure it out. Because what is a melting pot? What is the language of a melting pot? We know what the culture is. The culture is anti-women. The culture is a rape culture right now. It's anti-women. And we just need to look at women who we think are powerful and put them in the same situation as men and see that this is not the case. And we hear that in the entertainment industry. We look and we see that you would never think that feminism happened in the 60s and 70s. I mean, I can see some of you probably remember the times when it was in the media, women were burning their bras and asking for equality. And yet today, even in universities, women are not paid the same wages as their male colleagues with the same amount of education. And so we have a long way to go, because if women are being marginalized around the world, you can be sure that there is a totem pole of who is on the bottom. And who is on the bottom are Indigenous women. We only have to look at the statistics, we only have to look at the report of Stolen Sisters to know that Indigenous women are vulnerable to acts of violence, and these acts of violence are done so with impunity. And you have a government who's saying, we don't want an inquiry, we don't want a national plan of action. And why? Because we're still taking the land. It's all about the land, and it always will be about the land, at least for us. Mr. Stavenhagen, Rodolfo Stavenhagen, who was a great special rapporteur. I met him when he was during his time at the UN, and he talked about many things that colonization has done to Indigenous people. And he said one of the more serious human rights protection deficiencies in recent years is the trend towards the use of laws and the justice system to penalize and criminalize social protest activities and legitimate demands made by Indigenous organizations and movements in defense of their rights. And this is one of my favorite pictures of all times. Maybe someone here knows the young woman's name from Nosipagtag. But again, it's the women standing at the front. Any changes, any improvements, if you can call it improvements, within the Indian Act have all been done by women. It has been the women who have been pushing forward, and they did so by passing the hat and going to Ottawa. They did so by having meetings, not getting paid to go to meetings either. They did it because they cared about their children. They cared because they were not allowed to even be buried. Mary Tuax Early, who was one of the pioneers of the Aboriginal women's movement in the 60s and 70s, she started Indian Rights for Indian Women and Quebec Native women. And she said, a dog can be buried in Ganawage, but I can't. And this is because of colonization. And this is because that the women's are at least in Iroquois culture, are title holders to the land. Some of the fiercest people you'll meet are Mohawk women. But some of the kindest people you'll ever meet are Mohawk women. And so it's important that the voices of women, and especially the young women, they need to listen to the older women, as Kim Anderson was talking about in those days when we listened to our grannies, when we had the extended families, and we had that guidance to bring us in and to say, stop being silly. You know, you have a family to feed, you have responsibilities. We need to have those voices of women become even more stronger than what we see today. Recently you had Perry Bellegarde here. Perry Bellegarde is a friend of mine. And I appreciate the work that he's doing. But at the same time, the Assembly of First Nations was called the Indian Brotherhood. And it's always the men that we see in the front lines. And in my culture, the men protect the people and the women protect the land. And during the crisis, that's what the women did. We protected the land. We were the first ones to meet the police. We were the first ones to feel the volley of tear gas and concussion grenades. We were the ones, the majority at least, who went from March 8th to that time on July 11th in these blizzards, cold days, in front of fires, talking about it. And it was the women and some of the men who said, the land is really important. We're not letting them take one more square inch of our land. And they said, we'll let the women lead the way. Unfortunately, your government doesn't respect women. Whether it was Brian Mulroney, Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, dare I say Paul Martin, and of course we know Stephen Harper doesn't respect women. They could care less. They could care less about what it really means to have a nation-to-nation talk. And one of the things that we need to do as Indigenous people, as Uhua people, is to decolonize how we think about how negotiations should be. And that is bringing those aunties, those grandmothers, into negotiations. You know, right now at the UN, you have to be a lawyer, you have to study at least and read a few articles of international law. You have to have great allies like Paul Joff to be there to help you maneuver the UN system, which is, by the way, another colonial structure that continues to make Indigenous people speak with one voice. And it ignores that wisdom of the ages that was kind and compassionate and helped out. It is a way of being. It is a way of thinking about not just about yourself, but how you, as a living organism in this tiny blue planet, in this huge universe, what your impact is. And if we see that Indigenous government is going to succeed, it must be done on an equal footing for men and women. It cannot just be men that are making the decisions. It cannot just be men's perspective. It cannot just be about development. It cannot be just about one issue. And that's what Western society does. They pick one issue. What's the most important thing for you right now? Gee, I don't know. I'm hungry. You know? Or I don't know if I'm going to be able to pay my bills next month. And what people have done, like Canada and Enbridge, the people that sit on those boards, and I see it, I'm sure, because I know strategic plan. How many of you have done strategic planning in your organizations? I'm sure that from the time the Burger Commission was going on, that the oil companies did a strategic plan, whether it was 20, 30, 40, or 50 years, of how they were going to force not just Canadians, but Indigenous people into accepting pipelines by squeezing the market so that there would be no more jobs available. You're getting an education, but look, I mean, of course I'm an artist, so art is very different than, say, teaching English literature, philosophy, or geography, or anthropology. You know, artists is very competition, and so I believe that since the time of the Burger Inquiry, that the oil companies saw that they needed to coerce Indigenous communities, and that they would, and we see that now. We see that a lot of people working in the tar sands are Indigenous peoples. Why? Because there's no employment. We see that there is no way to have any kind of gainful employment unless there's somebody there to offer you a job. And even in the Burger Inquiry, he said, you know, Indigenous people need to be able to use their land. The White Paper Policy said the same thing. Economics for prosperity for Indigenous people, it comes from them being able to use their land. The UN Declaration talks about Indigenous people being able to decide how their land is used and how development will be on their land. And development is great. I'm not against development, but it must be sustainable. It cannot be this old dinosaur fossil fuels that we all rely upon. You know, every once in a while they inject a few things like, oh, the price of oil's gone down. We know we're going to go to the gas pumps and pay less for gas. But we know that in communities, and TransCanada has done it in my community, they gave $15,000 to the band council. And it's really like crazy making, I can tell you that. They gave $15,000 to the band council to do a traditional knowledge study. So go to Oka Park and tell us where your medicines are. Where are your sacred spots? And of course the band council, because, and I mean no offense in any way, because most of them are Christian, they are really not aware of their own culture, about the sacred ceremonies, about the medicines, the value of the medicines, the value of traditional knowledge. And so they said yes. TransCanada has been paying our people to work on refitting some pipes. And so it's coercion. It's really taking away, and it's really a shame on us that we are accepting this, because we are supposed to be looking 7 generations ahead. So 7 generations from now, let's say the youngest person in this room is 22. So let's take that person, age 22, and go from 7 generations from now from that person. What kind of a world will they be living in if we accept the pipelines to go through pristine areas? This is paradise, eh? We're talking about paradise. We're not talking about some shithole meteor that's coming through the galaxy. We're talking about a place where we need to drink, where we need to grow our food, to be contaminated and poisoned by oil that is laced with so many carcinogens that it's a well-kept guarded secret by the industry. And remember, but how many, okay, please raise your hands, because I know some of you are just nodding. Please don't be shy. How many of you remember in the 70s when they were talking about an oil crisis, and how many of you had to have your car sitting in line to gas up? Only 3 people? 4 people? 5? Come on, there must be more. I saw that, even in the tiny little community where I come from. And back then we were looking for what is sustainable? Where's the electric car? So we know what happened to the electric car. Now we have hybrids. But we should all be driving them by now. It's 2015. What are we driving? We're driving SUVs that are better on gas. Double catalytic converters. Yeah, that's wonderful. And I love this quote because you can take this from today. Chief Frank, and I don't know how to say his last name, but he was talking to one of the pipeline companies, and he told Mr. Robert Blair, he says, "You are like the Pentagon, planning the slaughter of innocent Vietnamese. Don't tell me you are not responsible. You are the 20th century General Custer. You are coming with your troops to slaughter us and steal land that is rightfully ours. You are coming to destroy a people that have a history of 30,000 years. Why? For 20 years of gas. Are you really that insane?" This is in 1975, before some of you were even born. So that goes to show how irresponsible, how ignorant, how arrogant all the leaders have been from that time in not providing sustainable energy and sustainable uses, sustainable ways of living for the people of this present generation. I think it's disgusting, I think it's a shame, but I think we all bear the blame. We all bear the blame because if we don't say anything about it, then we're saying, that's fine, that's okay. So let's kill paradise. Because we can live in our condominiums, and the condominiums can have a /greenhouse connected to it. And maybe we can grow food on the roofs, like they do in Montreal. On the roofs, we'll have a greenhouse and we can grow our own food. And it's too bad about that pipeline burst. On July 11th last year, on the 24th anniversary of the crisis, myself and others delivered a letter to the mayor of Oka, who told me he wasn't in that day, but when we went into the offices of the municipality, he was shirking around in the corner and we saw him, and so he came over, and so we hand-delivered the letter to him and we recorded it. But we said we must sit and discuss a solution based upon mutual respect. We ended up go with the great law of peace and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It must be based upon these standards. Negotiations must be based upon these standards. Because if we only accept colonial laws, colonial instruments, and forget about who we are as Indigenous people, we are really disrespecting our ancestors who died to bring us what we do have today, with the little bit of knowledge that we do have. And I'm sure we have like 1/100th of the Indigenous knowledge that was here at the time of Columbus arrived. And so this is what Iroquois communities look like today. And here we're up here, they still call us Oka. And everybody still calls us Oka. And even people from Ganawaga, they call us Okapokas and Okachis. But it's a beautiful country. It's a beautiful place that we see our people used to live in. And how many of you have heard about the grandmothers who walk around the Great Lakes? Josephine. And I remember talking to her when the first round that she did it, she told me, we need to talk to the waters. We need to talk to the waters and tell them that we love them still, the water spirits. We need to tell the water spirits that we still care. That's a lot of walking by grandmothers, carrying buckets of water. And they had no money, they just went on their own steam. They relied on the kindness of strangers to put them up in their homes. And she told me the worst place that they experienced racism was in Detroit, around Detroit area. And people were yelling at very disgusting remarks to her and the elders that were carrying the water. And it saddens me to see that and to hear about those things that our elders still have to go through. So I'm going to present to you a few of the maps from some of the pipelines, and again you'll see the little tiny little red shirking person, looks like a person, that's Ganasodagi. But this is our area. Now Ganasodagi means the place where the crusty sand dunes lie. There is sand in Rigaud and Hudson all around this area. And I think we need to think outside the box when we talk about communities and the names. I think our communities were a spirit. And I think when people said we're going to Ganasodagi, they meant the spirit of this part of the land. And this is Montreal, Tiohtià:ke, or Bizarre. This morning I crossed here. I crossed the river, I crossed the ice bridge to get here. My car, I wasn't sure was going to start, so I'm glad to be here. So this is Enbridge Line 9 and 9B, also coming right into my community, right there. And the things we need to do requires an expensive lawyer in order to fight this. It requires the open-mindedness of ordinary citizens like yourselves. It requires the negotiations with municipalities, provincial and federal governments, and it requires us to do our ceremonies, because our ceremonies are part of our sovereignty. In 1995, the Royal Commission called for a renewed relationship between Aboriginal people in Canada based upon mutual respect, recognition, responsibility, and sharing. And when we say sharing, I think a lot of people have a misinterpretation of what sharing means. For me, from what I've been told, is sharing means, okay, you can come and you can live off the land with us, but the land is still ours. It's still under our authority. It's still under our care. And people like to use like really weak, fluffy words like stewardship. Oh yes, Indigenous people, you have the stewardship of the land. It's a lot of good it did us to call it stewardship. Because we keep losing our land. And while we lose our land, we lose our connection to the land. And right now the government's pushing a lot of money into urban areas so that we can all flock to the cities. So we can become the civilized Canadians, participating, paying taxes, and being part of the Canadian dynamics and identity. And if you refuse, Bill 51 is just around the corner. If you refuse, well, the Canadian Army is, they're just on standby. And I put this up because it makes no sense what we're doing. It makes no sense what we're doing to the planet, because the planet's going to be here long after we're extinct. And we need this water. We need to understand the importance of water. It takes 2 tons of tar sands to make 1 barrel of oil. How many people knew that? That's a lot of tar sands. And the tar sands would not be profitable to any of the oil companies if they didn't have huge subsidies from the Canadian government. Imagine the Canadian government paying your tax-paying dollars to go to Europe, to promote it to Germany, to promote it to the European Union. Geez, BP oil, even though they had to pay billions of dollars to clean up the Gulf of Mexico, which they're still cleaning up, still recorded a profit that year. And so why is the Canadian taxpayer paying for Stephen Harper to go and promote tar sands oil in other parts of the world? Nobody questions this. But yet you'll question how much money is going to the child welfare system for Indigenous people's families. People question, geez, how much money did Teresa Spence spend? How much money are we spending on Indigenous peoples for land claims? You know, these kinds of critical thinking is not going on by the Globe and Mail, at least not too much. It's not going on, definitely, in institutions like this, unless you're lucky to have a professor like Professor Malloy. Nobody's asking these questions. Nobody's protesting on Parliament Hill. Now, there was this strange campaign, I didn't get involved in, it was called Stop Canada, or Stop Canada? Is that what it's called? And I think what needs to happen is a campaign to wake up Canada and stop this colonial amnesia that continues to happen in teaching and in thinking and in dealing with issues of great importance. We can't keep doing unsustainable things, because eventually not only will fresh water die out, but we'll die out. And there's a really interesting saying, and I think our ancestors knew this since they were children. But there's an interesting thing that the same air that the dinosaurs breathed, we are breathing today. So the same air that our ancestors were breathing at the time of contact, we're breathing today. So you can imagine what we're doing to the atmosphere today, that future generations will be breathing. If you look at Beijing, you know, I have a friend who just came back from Beijing, and people are wearing masks. The air is so polluted, you probably could float on top of it. You could probably walk on top of it. And Indigenous people have been at the forefront of the environment, of trying to preserve the environment. Thomas Banyanka, in the last address that he made to the UN Assembly, and he did this he was persistent, imploring them to stop the kind of development that is destroying the planet. He told them that, I am not here to tell you to stop what you are doing. I am here to tell you to get your people ready for what is coming. And people are talking about the winds, the rain, and this generation probably you're not too familiar. But my generation and older, maybe a little bit younger than me, we know that the winds are much stronger than they used to be. We know that the rain is kind of like someone's pouring a bucket from the clouds. It's not a gentle rain anymore. There's more hurricanes. And all of a sudden scientists know this. So let's pay attention, because Indigenous people, they're a bunch of superstitious, folklorish simpletons. But I want to change that attitude, because if you look at what Indigenous people have contributed, whether it's medicines, 76% of medicines that we find in pharmaceutical companies come from Indigenous knowledge. Coffee, cocoa beans, corn, beans, squash, not the corn that Monsanto grows. Indigenous people gave so many gifts of their traditional knowledge, and it would be nice to be recognized, if not just to teach and to promote that kind of knowledge that is needed. And it would be nice and really exciting if all institutions could teach about the Indian residential schools, but it would be also wonderful and exciting if they would teach about the positive things that Indigenous peoples have contributed to the world and still contribute. We talk about being very resilient people. Sometimes I think it's just because we're so stubborn. But the resiliency comes, I think it's part of our DNA, but it's also part of that kind of love of life The love of seeing a hummingbird, the love of that memory of our ancestors, the memory of walking into a home and in the winter smelling that wood. I'm sure many of you here remember those times. Really, really simple things. We've complicated life so much that I think we are more stressed than previous generations. I know the internet stresses me out because I have to answer people's emails. And I have to answer questions that I think really demand more of a discussion than anything. I told you, John, to stop me if I get carried away, and you didn't. I don't know if we're going to have question and answers. So let me just think what I want to close with. This year is the 25th anniversary of the occupation of Gunnesabaga. And I'm just really grateful to people like, there was a group in Montreal called les Regroupements pour Solidarité avec les Autochtones, the Native Solidarity Group, who were protesting in front of Robert Bourassa's offices almost every day. French sovereignists, Quebecois sovereignists, saying that we cannot accept and go on with our sovereignty until we start to respect and uphold Indigenous people's sovereignty. I'm thankful to all the people who blockaded, little railways or roads right across Canada. I'm grateful that things like click and spam exist, because otherwise I wouldn't have had any meat and protein that summer. I'm grateful for the people who came to help us, our allies. But I want to really emphasize something that really bothers me, that has bothered me since the warrior flag was flown. The crisis or the occupation was not a warrior issue. It was not perpetuated by the warriors. It was by the community of Gunnesabaga and the people. And I hope that to the 25th anniversary, people will start recognizing it. Yes, there's this flashy, sexy image, to a soldier and a warrior who's masked. You don't see his face, so that you have to find out from someone who was there, who is this guy? That's the image that people remember us of. Never mind that the police tried to kill us, and that I'm lucky that we did our ceremonies, and I'm lucky that because of those ceremonies, I am alive here to tell you about that story. I am very fortunate that I had good elders to teach me, to help me through the dysfunctional chaos that was in the community. Because of them, some of the people that you call heroes from that time, and I won't name them, they were really not that good. They were causing trouble. They were giving us a headache. But I'm also thankful to the stubbornness, I guess, of my family and my elders and my ancestors. Because we wouldn't have, one thing this is a good example of it. The SQ told one of our allies after they started arresting people on September 26th. They told one of our allies, these are not normal people. Usually when we throw tear gas and concussion grenades, people run away. These people didn't. We don't understand them, and that's one of the things that I think, when you have a solid identity and a solid idea of who you are, your beliefs and convictions give you that strength to continue and to stand up to adversity. Because I can tell you that SWAT team, they were shaking in their boots. It's very unnerving for a man who's got, I don't know, I'm not a gun expert, but there was some kind of semi-automatic weapon, and he's holding it like this. It's not very comfortable when you don't have a weapon. It's not a very easy feeling to be shot at and see bullets fly by you. And then to later find out that someone has died for a stupid thing like a golf course. Because people are greedy. Because people want more money. And But people who, we had guys who were like on drugs and been in and out of jail, who quit drugging, and who really shined that summer because they felt they had a purpose. They felt like they were walking with their ancestors. The issue is the land. The issue will always be about the land, as I said before. The issue is not about a man who's wearing a mask and holding a weapon. And it's not even about a woman who stands in front of a guy holding a weapon. It's really about people. It's really about life. It's really about the beauty of life. And one day, we'll hear an apology. And one day, we will have a kinder version of history than what we see today. Because the version of history that you have today is just propaganda swill. And the democracy that you have today is just fascism disguised as democracy. On April 11th, there's going to be a huge march for the climate change. Climate change is supposed to be the greatest challenge of today's society according to the UN. But I disagree. I think the greatest challenge to global society is fear, ignorance, racism, gender discrimination, and the theft of the environment from future generations. It is a very difficult time that we're going through, all of us. Indigenous people are no exception. And I hope that this kind of thing will continue to go on, and that our people will wake up. Indigenous people, Goma people, Setgetsko, rise up. Because our time is now. If we do not do it now, it will never happen. So I thank you for John to invite me and for listening to me tonight. And destroy that from us. So lasting peace cannot be achieved only through military or political means, but through a higher level of consciousness and understanding. There can be no lasting peace while fear or anger exists between people. And I'm sure Buddha and Jesus Christ and Allah and all the religions of the world, they would agree with the Iroquois philosophy on what is peace and how to achieve that peace. There was no philosopher that wrote it in a book. It was something that our people lived, and I say was. And so in Ganessadage we had Sulpician priests, and Sulpician priests were blue bloods from France. They were not like the Jesuits who took an oath to poverty. They were actually rich blue bloods from France. And the second they arrived in the dead of winter around this time of year, and you can see is it Lake Bryce you called it? Where you see the wind they're walking through the dead of winter in something like that. And only crazy people would do that. And they weren't crazy. These were businessmen who were disguised as priests. And they came to a village they knew existed. And they knew they would be greeted. They knew they would be fed. And they knew they would be kept warm in Ganessadage. And the image, the Keystone Pipeline one is one I borrowed off the internet. And the other one is something I just did because of the pipelines and the prophecy. Canada wants to do something. And when they talk about honor of the crown, and accommodating us, it must not violate Canada's assumed sovereignty over our lands. So Canada has a long way to go as a country in being honest about its origins, in being honest about the genocide that it and its motherland in England, and yes, I will say even in France and other countries, have committed against Indigenous peoples. In 1995, our community published a book, our history book of Kanesatake, and I'm going to take you a little bit through what Kanesatake is, because Indian Affairs still thinks that we come from the Mohawk Valley, and we did not. At least the people from Kanesatake and Tiohtià:ke, which is Montreal, did. There were people in the Mohawk Valley for sure. But one of the things that our elders taught us during this time of research is about peace, and that's what Kainarako is supposed to be about. And Kainarako is the big law, the great law of peace. And so the foundations of that peace are respect, peace, love, and strength. So we need all of those things to become a healthy nation. And as we know, the genocide, Indian residential schools, and everything about colonialism tried to take that away and tried.
You all know Ellen. I was going to show you pictures of when you first met her, which of course was at Oka, on the television, on the radio, the newspapers, and as she had been chosen and was the spokesperson at the occupation to prevent the, although it was an attack on my culture, to prevent the building of yet another golf course. And of course the disinterment of the traditional burial place for people in that community. I remember that I was left alone that summer in the Native Studies Department, as I believe it then was. I think everyone had fled for summer, this, that, and the other thing. Even my colleague, I think, David Newhouse, was gone, which meant that the switchboard of the university sent all the calls to me because they were phoning up saying, what the hell's going on? So I did take a call, and I picked the phone up and I heard this woman yelling at me, what the hell is going on? She was very upset and very excited. She turned out it was a journalist from Buffalo, and she said to me, I can sit in my office and look across the border and see Canada. She said, it's always been a place of sanity, security, warmth, calm. What the F is going on up there? And of course she was talking about Oka and talking about the coverage and the excitement that had generated. That of course was not even the beginning of Ellen's activist career, and certainly hasn't been the end of her activist career. And she is now a nationally and international figure of resistance on many fronts, having to do with history, culture, language, and identity of Aboriginal people, the sacredness of their land, and the need to protect that land from unrestrained development. She comes to that work as a traditional person, but also having done a fine arts degree at Concordia University, which is, as we all know, there's one or two students who went to Concordia, is most well known for people who teach in the communications program there. And she was until what, 2010, president of the Quebec Native Women's Association. She's been heavily involved in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as was Jennifer and Paul, who came here last week. So her paper will weave that, as the title shows you, into discussions of assaults on Native rights by pipeline development and resource development. So I'm thrilled to be able to bring Ellen Gabriel here this evening and to let her have the floor for as long as she wants. A couple of hours probably. She told me that when Mohawks get started, you know the rest of the sentence. So set your clocks, right? Ellen, thank you.
Sebo, sebo sni predstavno genjatu. Kanya kahaga genjatu te tanugana sadagi na sanadira. Tinuratu sni na kutsung anga wahutsa. Awandi kut kinisa aare. My Mohawk name is Katsitsabwas. I am Turtle Clan from the community of Kanesatake. You know it as Oka. It's not near Oka or by Oka. Oka is Kanesatake. I'm going to try and take you through a 25-year journey that I've had as an activist since that time. And as John says, you know, Mohawks, once we get started, or I think any Iroquois people, once you get started, it's kind of hard to stop us. So you'll just have to say, come on now, you know, we're sleepy, it's time to go home. So I'm going to try and talk a bit about development, the continued development on Indigenous peoples' lands, the theft of our lands and resources by Canada, by colonial states. And Canada's sovereignty is based on three legal fictions, as are many of states within the Americas. And so we have the doctrine of discovery, papal bulls, and terra nullius. And these are all what Canada still bases its sovereignty on, in spite of the kinds of accomplishments and in spite of, I think, even the Constitution Act of 1982 relies on the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, because whenever